Good afternoon. Welcome to our Synapse Third Thursday webinar. Excited to be with you all this afternoon to talk about the tools and data that are available and what the needs are regarding electrification. Just some logistics of this presentation. We have support for this work from NREL and from NEEP, and we'll have each of them talk a little bit about their role and contributions here in just a moment. But in the meantime, just some logistics around this meeting. First, we are going to try to be a little bit more interactive in this webinar than we have been in the past, trying to use some of the tools that WebEx provides. So hope that you all will choose to interact with us, but also hope that you will bear with us as we try out these new things and see how we can get them working well for this meeting and for future ones. I'll just note related to that we have developed a two-question survey that you will receive at the end, so please stick around and fill that out. We are recording the webinar, and we will circulate the recording to all attendees along with the slides. We've muted you all on entry. You'll remain muted throughout, and we'll try the Q&A at the end, the interactive portion. We will do via email questions that you may send. Please send them to webinar@synapse-energy.com. Please send them as you have them, and my colleagues here in the room will help parse and collect them and pass them on to feed the discussion at the end of the call, at the end of the webinar. So again, webinar@synapse-energy.com. You can use the chat feature within WebEx, but we're using that primarily if you are having technical issues with the webinar itself or with audio issues during the presentation. This is a recurring series, as you would guess from the title of Third Thursday webinars. We tend to do them on the third Thursday of the month. Next month, our topic will be the EV regional emissions and demand impact tool that Synapse has developed, continuing on an aspect of the electrification theme. You'll notice that if you write all that out, it's spelled EV ready. So we're looking forward to sharing that tool with you 4 weeks from today, the third Thursday of October, October 18th. You can register for that webinar at synapse-energy.com/webinars. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Elizabeth and then to Allison to give some sense of this project from the NEEP and NREL perspective.
Thank you so much, Asa. It's been really fun to be working on this project with Asa Hopkins and Kenji Takahashi from Synapse. I am the Director of Research and Evaluation at NEEP, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, which is a nonprofit. And we are pleased today to present results from recent research, how we spent our summer on this topic. And I'd like to acknowledge that our research was funded by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the U.S. Department of Energy, and I'm pleased to first turn this over to Allison Holmes from NREL to give a quick introduction.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Holm. I'm a project leader with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And just for a little bit of background and context, NREL recognizes that state and local jurisdictions often drive energy innovation and are at the forefront of a changing electric grid. And we work directly with state, local, and tribal governments across the country to provide data and applied research and analysis support. Under this umbrella, one of the things we do is partner directly with NEEP and other regional energy efficiency organizations to engage a wide range of stakeholders and to deliver regionally tailored energy efficiency technical assistance. But also by understanding regional challenges and stakeholder perspectives through these strategic partnerships, we're better able to inform the NREL and broader national lab and DOE research portfolios. So we're really excited to be on this webinar, and Elizabeth, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks a lot. And if you are not already familiar with NEEP, it's one of the regional organizations in the country, and our research on strategic electrification is hugely relevant to our mission, which is to advance energy efficiency throughout the region, which extends from Maine to West Virginia, and to support the state and local efforts to achieve the decarbonization goals that are so important to all of us. Next slide, please. As you may know, this research is an outgrowth of previous work that NEEP has done. We produced a white paper on the regional assessment of strategic electrification, and that was conducted by Synapse and Meister last year. And we also produced an action plan for strategic electrification. The research that we're going to hear about today is an outgrowth of both of those activities, and we were very pleased to be able to work again with the Synapse team on this particular project. We feel it's really important for NEEP and the region as a whole to engage in opportunities to share knowledge, build awareness, and develop tools and resources and, looking ahead, best practices that can support strategic electrification. And we highly value your feedback as you listen to this, so we encourage questions and comments. And we hope that this webinar will help inspire further work and help us fill knowledge gaps. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Asa.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just a little bit about Synapse. Many of you may be familiar with us. We are a consultancy based in Cambridge, Mass. We are a leader for public interest and government clients in providing rigorous analysis of the energy sector. In particular, our expertise has historically been in the electric sector, but as electrification takes hold, the thermal and transportation sectors move into the areas where we have been particularly active, and we are continuing to grow into those other areas. I'm joined here this afternoon by my colleague Kenji Takahashi, who led much of the work on this project. Pleased to be working with him as always. We have introduced ourselves, and this is now an opportunity to try to learn a little bit about you all. So as part of our interactive test, to get a sense of where you are coming from, we would welcome you to fill out the poll that just appeared on your screen and tell us what kind of organization you might represent, so we understand a little bit more who we're talking with today. So as the poll wraps up, thank you all for participating in that, and we're learning here about how those results show up for us, and we will, at the very least, hopefully be able to share a little bit back with you later in the presentation about who you all are as we get towards the discussion portion of the presentation. the objectives of this webinar today are to first to introduce the survey that we conducted, and then to tell you a little bit about the results that we obtained through that survey, share key findings derived from the responses that we got, but also particularly to seek further feedback from you all on valuable tools and resources, the needs that you feel you have that you haven't yet figured out how to meet, and also to facilitate and interest you all in resource sharing on different kinds of strategic electrification activities. The objective of this survey that we conducted was to identify the useful tools, resources, databases, data sources that different stakeholders across the northeastern region, by which we defined to be New England plus New York, both what those folks are currently using to promote or assess the impacts of strategic electrification, and what they would like to have to further their work directly or indirectly concerning electrification. This is in the interest of allowing states that are interested to accelerate strategic electrification by fostering resource sharing, finding gaps, and identifying research needs and other areas where there are needs regarding strategic electrification. We've sent a short survey, 5 open-ended questions, to about 80 stakeholders, again, as I mentioned, across New England and New York. We received responses from 20 different entities or agencies. The breakdown of the type of respondents is shown here. We were particularly interested, given the connection to DOE and the role of state energy offices as the face and interface between states and DOE, to particularly get follow-up from each of the 7, and answers from each of the 7 state energy offices, which we did. The other respondents included folks from state consumer advocates, utility regulators, utilities and program administrators, local governments, as well as a smattering of other classes of participants. You'll see as we go through that this distribution doesn't necessarily give an absolute complete picture. I would not say that this was a statistically significant survey by any stretch of the imagination. So the intention of this is really to give a first cut on understanding of the electrification activities and needs across the region. So the first question we asked was basically to the respondents, well, what sort of things are you actually doing in your role that relate to electrification in some manner or other? We've got quite a diverse set of responses, and indication that folks are still developing those activities, that the approaches are not yet mature. So there's a lot of development and initial actions amongst these responses. So we saw some folks who are engaged in sort of big picture policy and planning, whether it's developing strategies to reach long-term goals or promoting electrification through various different kinds of programs, codes, whether they're through incentives or milestones or just developing new frameworks. We saw also folks interested in understanding and gathering information about sort of what is going on and what the impacts might be and what the best practices are. So evaluation of various different kinds of impacts. People are interested in exploring best practices. They have some interest in what the future regulatory frameworks might be that would work with these. And then we also saw a class of responses around folks really interested in understanding what's going on in the market, both at the sort of macro scale in terms of the overall market characteristics for things like heat pumps, how to segment the market, who the potential customers are, all the way down to much more granular needs like understanding contractor training and the supply chain and engaging with manufacturers. And then from the respondents who themselves actually own buildings or operate vehicle fleets, we found that folks were interested in investigating the opportunities around electrifying their own hardware. Looking across the respondents in terms of current activities, the interested folks who responded really do seem to be at different stages of assessing or promoting, assessing electrification or promoting it. Some folks, some jurisdictions don't have policies or activities to promote electrification but want to understand electrification. Others are at the early stages of promoting electrification and are seeking to understand more and develop new tools and resources. And others have a more mature set of tools and resources that they use, but are still looking for more and looking to improve the tools and resources that they have. So it is quite a wide range of engagement that we see across the respondent set. We asked folks what tools, resources, and data they're currently using when they're trying to go about doing those different kinds of activities. And when we looked across the respondents, we identified that there were a few approaches that were in common across the different kinds of respondents, but in other cases, we could really separate out that certain classes of respondents, whether they're energy offices or utilities, really have their own unique tools and resources that they are using that help meet their particular needs. So the way we're structuring this presentation is to first talk about the common approaches that are being taken across respondents with some examples, and then to talk about each of those different classes and what their particular approach to resources has been. So in terms of the common approaches across the respondents, one thing we heard from nearly all of the respondents is that they're using various different kinds of tools and studies to evaluate various impacts of electrification. They're definitely interested in things like cost effectiveness, grid impacts, impact on emission trajectories, et cetera. We also, and perhaps this was a little bit of self-selection planting bias because the survey came from NEEP, but we did hear from a number of folks that the reports and guidelines from NEEP were among the tools and that people were interested in. The cold climate heat pump specification that NEEP has developed, for example, was mentioned by a number of respondents. And then I think you could look through these responses and develop a small library of the electrification-specific or more general decarbonization studies, white papers, and published resources that folks cited. There were a number, we put the cover page of a number of those mentioned pieces here on the slide, whether they're from NEEP, whether they're state reports that was developed in say, Vermont or Rhode Island, whether it's the Electrification Future Studies from NREL, or work from Rocky Mountain Institute, MJ Bradley, sort of financial assessments, people looking for electric vehicle assessments from folks like Morgan Stanley or Deloitte or Bloomberg. People cited EIA and EPRI studies. There's a lot of studies and research that have come out over the last year or two in this topic, and our survey respondents were definitely collectively at least very aware of this literature and cited different aspects of it that were relevant to their work. In terms of the particular tools and resources that we heard about from energy offices, they, perhaps with justification, cited particularly state energy strategies and plans and state climate change action plans, many of which are developed in partnership or by those offices directly as tools and resources that they refer to as they go about their work. There's also a number of different kinds of scenario analyses, whether it's the total energy study in Vermont or the analysis that Massachusetts is doing for its upcoming comprehensive energy plan, or the renewable thermal market analysis that has been conducted in Rhode Island. They also mentioned particular kinds of modeling tools related to understanding heat pump penetration and different kinds of benefit cost analyses on the building side. And then on the transportation side, a number of different kinds of tools on transportation. The EvaluateNY tool I'll show you a screenshot of in just a moment, looking at where electric vehicles are being registered within states, definitely something of interest, where the charging stations are, and then several folks at least mentioned the multi-state zero-emission vehicle memorandum of understanding and action plan as a resource that they turn to understand the different kinds of actions that they can take and how they fit into a more comprehensive picture. So just a couple of examples of the tools that folks mentioned. The EvaluateNY tool developed for NYSERDA is a data resource showing the penetration of the EV market and EV charging in a number of different respects. Quite a nice graphical interface. On the study side, the Renewable Thermal Strategy in Rhode Island includes analyses like bill impacts of potential heat pump incentive programs and adoption, both for electric and gas. And then another example, the Total Energy Study in Vermont that took a sort of long-term big picture decarbonization view of what the trajectory might look like to meet Vermont's policy goals and what that means in terms of big picture shifts in both heating and transportation towards electric options. Here, this chart showing the increase in electric consumption in a aggressive policy case, while the consumption of nearly every other type of energy falls off. The local government responses, our local government respondents were in Providence, Boston, and New York City. They had a similar interest in scenario analysis, looking, but I think at the city level. They're also interested in understanding in more detail what's actually going on in the buildings within their cities, understanding the different classes of markets within cities. They're also the respondents, the recipients of direction from state policymakers, and as that flows through utility efficiency programs. So the existence of utility efficiency programs and grants and how those relate to electrification was definitely getting the attention of the folks in Boston. And also city respondents are interested in understanding what they could learn by looking for examples with other cities in comparable geographic or climate areas to try to understand how to learn best practices at the city level. The respondents who are involved in administering energy efficiency programs, the particular tools and resources that they refer to are very much those kinds of tools and resources that are necessary to and unique to the world of regulated energy efficiency, whether it's cost effectiveness analysis, program design, things like understanding what the customer economics would be, customer payback, understanding how markets will develop, modeling, forecasting tools, and also the particular kinds of reference materials, technical reference manuals, and program evaluations that are characteristic of regulated efficiency in the utility world. For example, in that last category, the CADMA studies on the performance of ductless mini-split systems in Massachusetts. We had a few different respondents who were not don't fit neatly into any one of our categories, and so looking at the other kinds of tools that they mentioned, the folks from Belmont Light, which is a municipal here in Massachusetts, mentioned their data management and billing systems for the AMI data, and we'll talk about AMI data in a moment, but they talked about being able to use those as a tool. One of the things about the classes of folks who responded to the survey that we would like to rectify in the future is that we didn't get any response to the survey from folks who work for air regulatory agencies. So we have essentially sort of people who have experience working in that world from US EPA and from the Regulatory Assistance Project, who are our sort of proxies for what we might expect air regulators to have contributed. But there is a missing set of additional insights that we could hope to get if we're able to engage with those audiences in the future. So in the air regulatory space, the MOVES model, the motor vehicle emission simulator developed by EPA, and integrating that with the integrated planning model, which is related to state air emissions regulation. Also, the AVERT model that EPA has related to emissions, and the COBRA model for health impacts were mentioned by both RAP and EPA. Also interesting is that a number of respondents across the board mentioned that they were tracking relevant regulatory proceedings in Vermont, Rhode Island, New York, and California. Not everyone tracking every one of those, but notably, if you notice from California on the list, folks are interested in looking at what was going on, not just in their own state, but in other states as well, to learn what the insights they might be able to gather about electrification from other places as well as their own state. On the data front, the data needs generally fall into two broad categories. One is, or data that folks are using. One is just understanding what's actually going on out there in the real world in the market data, sales, costs, which vehicles are being sold, where are they being registered, which kinds of heat pumps are being installed by whom. And then data on energy impact, data from ISO New England or the Energy Information Administration, from utilities. Both folks in Vermont and Belmont Light, where they have access to smart meter data, are starting to use that data to look at the load shapes of different end uses, and mentioned that in particular, being able to harness that AMI data. And then folks are interested, for the purposes of doing cost-benefit analysis, in the avoided cost data on what we'd actually get from electrification in terms of avoided emissions, avoided energy costs, avoided fuel costs. Just a snapshot on one of the tools and data sources that folks mentioned, the Alternative Fuels Data Center. One portion of that is quite a good collection of all of the different EV charging stations categorized by different types of charging. This is a screenshot here of the Northeast, and you can see where the highways are, where there are corridors, where there are gaps that could be filled to complete corridor planning for EVs, as well as understanding aggregate statistics about the density of different kinds of EV charging infrastructure. So looking at the tools and resources and data that folks are currently using, it seems to us that states are still in the early stages of understanding electrification. There are common approaches, but we think it's too early to identify best practices. There are promising practices. There are tools that are interesting that could potentially be shared with others, but necessarily identifying those as best practices is premature. One thing about, again, perhaps related to the class of respondents that we were able to get for the survey, is that we heard more about more developed tools across the region for analyzing heat pumps and buildings than we did about EVs. That was somewhat surprising to us from a sort of first principles outcome, and I think it may respond as much to who responded as to the actual state of the world there. We had a number of respondents for utility efficiency programs, for example, who are used to working in buildings and are working in buildings now, much less engaged in transportation. Well, we didn't have the air regulators who have been the traditional lead on mobile source emissions and the zero emission vehicles, et cetera. So that that colors a little bit the sense of what we heard and didn't hear. So I would take this piece not as a general statement, but more as a statement of what we heard from the particular respondents that we did hear from. In terms of looking forward to tools, resources, and data needs that folks identified, here we do have, again, some split between the different kinds of respondents interested in different kinds of things, data sources going forward. Energy offices interested in understanding the impacts and trade-offs involved in electrification, benefit cost analyses, and understanding what the barriers are to adoption. Definitely interested in what it takes to enable markets to grow for these different technologies. So again, on the understanding those barriers, but also what particular kinds of resources, inspections might be necessary to get trained, high-quality installations of these technologies out into the real world. Also, interest in really understanding what might be coming down the pike, how to use different kinds of tools to forecast what's coming for EVs or residential thermal installations, and understanding where we are today and where we might be some number of years in the future to be ready for planning purposes. Local governments more interested generally in the practical details for city-specific needs, whether it's the particularities of heat pumps in large buildings, which are obviously more prevalent in the large cities of the region than they are elsewhere, and understanding what the particular issues would be around first costs, O&M costs, utility costs by geography, and really understanding on a much more granular practical level. Also, local governments run fleets of vehicles. Providence folks mentioned the question of when electric school buses might actually really be available so that they could start to integrate them into the actual operations of the city. Also, folks interested in concrete case studies, really understanding heat pump retrofits, for example, in specific situations that might be replicable. City respondents also mentioned equity, and were a little more likely than others to mention customer impacts, customer preferences, and contractor, trying to understand, again, that is a little bit closer to the ground, less big picture policy, more what does it take to make things happen on a building by building or vehicle by vehicle basis. Other particular needs that were mentioned that we thought were particularly interesting, again, RAP folks and EPA folks being our sort of proxy air regulator respondents, interested in how to estimate the pollutant and air quality impacts of EVs and heat pumps so that they can be integrated into state implementation plans for air quality compliance. A couple of other interesting pieces, market research on sort of customer preferences, customer willingness to adopt new technology, try to understand what that will look like, and then what the rate impacts will be from electrification due to changes in the overall load chain. On the data front, people's data needs were extensive, or data desires at least were extensive. They were, we split them out by type of sort of sector. On the buildings and heat pumps side, folks interested very much in understanding where heat pumps are going in, who's installing them, how many installers are there, which products are being installed, what's necessary to do a quality installation. Trying to understand that penetration by state and by market segment, try to understand both heat pumps and the fossil fuel heating systems or others that are being displaced, try to understand how those things relate to each other on both a cost and performance basis, and then to understand that much more about the buildings into which these heating systems are being installed and what the interactions might be between buildings and their heating system. Similar kind of market needs, the market data needs on the electric vehicle front, understanding which vehicles are selling, how they're performing in the real world. Folks who are trying to process data from DMVs commonly need insights about the bin string, how they're associated with the different models so that they can parse that data and pull that out. Interestingly, folks did not have a lot of needs for trying to understand costs around what at this point is your sort of typical level 2 light-duty vehicle charger, but instead we're sort of moved on from there towards fast chargers and towards the charging for medium and heavy-duty electric vehicles. One thing that one of our respondents pointed out that definitely carried forward as a key finding is that the Desire database they generally would like to know what everybody else is doing with respect to EV incentives, rebates, what the status of legislation is in different places. And the Desire database, which is the database of state incentives for renewable energy, tracks a lot of this same kind of information for renewable energy and for energy efficiency, but not for any electric vehicle policies. And so that not having that kind of information in folks, the main resource that folks might turn to was a definite lack that respondents pointed out. In terms on the impact side, there's a lot of expressed desire to understand more about data around EVs or around electrification generally on the grid. More and better information on end-use metering and sub-metering, trying to figure out how to disaggregate loads, how to think about load controls. Both the electric heat pump water heaters and electric vehicles are particularly promising for controllable loads, but folks would like to know more about what is actually needed in terms of communications and infrastructure to make the most of those loads. Speaking of controlled and uncontrolled loads, respondents are definitely interested in trying to understand what the actual load shapes of these new electrification needs are. Are they peak coincident? How might they change if there were different kinds of incentives or rates that were applied to them in order to understand what the grid cost side of the cost-benefit analysis might get you? And then folks interested in sort of time and location-specific impacts. Where can you electrify to the greatest extent while minimizing the need for grid upgrades geographically, as well as understanding the marginal emissions, I think both on a space basis around the country, but also on a time basis in terms of load shapes. And then a general request for a database of electrification-related program information or best practices. This is the same kind of ask as the EV-specific ask with respect to the Desire database that I just talked about. So, in summary, thinking back about the key findings of how folks are engaging with electrification across the region, the key topics that folks are interested in are basically a whole suite of different kinds of impacts, economic impacts, emissions impacts, grid impacts, understanding what those impacts are at different levels of market penetration, and then a class of both current analyses and tools, but also future needs around what the performance and costs are of the relevant electrification technologies. Those general themes carried through across the respondents in general, but there were different, particular unique areas of interest that stuck out from different classes of respondents. Energy offices interested in what the regulatory framework and tariff designs might be, local governments being that much more grounded in the buildings that they and EV fleets that they might control, and efficiency implementers interested that much more in the regulatory requirements and such around cost effectiveness and what it would mean to bring fuel switching into the efficiency, regulated efficiency realm. While we didn't have that many respondents who talked about EV or about AMI data in particular, those who did have access to it were very positive about it, and so we would say that a finding is that we don't yet know exactly what the AMI data how exactly it will prove itself, but the folks who have it are excited about it. It appears interesting and promising what's the direction to go in the future. So generally speaking, there are a lot of overlaps in terms of what the different kinds of data and databases that the respondents would like to be able to see in terms of access to raw data. That at the same time that there's a lot of overlap, it's also just quite extensive. There's a great diversity of the different kinds of data and databases that the respondents would like to get. I'll mention here just in passing that we had the opportunity to present some of these results to folks from ISO New England a couple of weeks ago. We had not invited them to respond to the survey, but their response in that conversation was largely that I think that the findings of the survey aligned with their understanding of what the state of play is in the region, what the needs are. They expressed particular interest in understanding market dynamics, penetration, but also what the status of different policy interventions might be. They were particularly interested in the near term. That was something that stuck out that they made a point of, was trying to understand what the next 5 years look like, in addition to understanding what levels of deep penetration might look like in the longer term. They are also interested and supportive of one of our key recommendations here on our final slide. They're interested in sharing information and resources across the region, and our primary recommendation after parsing through the results of this survey is that sharing resources amongst the stakeholders in the region can accelerate strategic electrification. So steps towards that kind of sharing would include sharing the resources and data that folks do have access to on these topics across the region. Where there are gaps, their stakeholders can work together across the region to conduct joint studies or at least coordinate studies, make sure that assumptions are in common, for example, across different kinds of analyses, so that we're not comparing apples and oranges downstream after everybody's paid for their work. Definitely, there are existing resources out there that whether they are developed by one state but not well known by others, or developed by DOE and the national labs, or by other parties willing to share, that could meet some of the needs that folks have expressed. I'll just mention there are a couple of folks in responses mentioned the AVERT tool from EPA, EVI tool, PRO tool from NREL, COBRA health impacts, the alternative fuels database, but there are other tools that might be relevant, like SCOUT and REDSTOC, which are developed by NREL and DOE, around understanding the building stock and the potential for energy efficiency in different kinds of building. Energy Plus is the building energy model that undergirds some of those tools. And then another tool called ADOPT, which is an EV adoption model that could meet some of these needs that exist out there if folks were aware of them and could get plugged in and trained up at how to use them. There are existing efforts and organizations underway that could be used to address needs, whether that's folks in the national labs or coordinating regional action, for example, through NEEP. And also just generally, there are lots of other people in the region interested in electrification, and if folks do a good job of reaching out and talking to each other and sharing what they're doing and sharing the resources that they have, that folks will be able to that much more effectively meet whatever needs there are, whether whether you're interested in just trying to understand impacts or you're interested in trying to move markets. Still, there are resources in the region that collectively are building and could meet their needs. We are still in early days. There's still plenty of work to do, but we are. It seems like folks are well engaged in trying to meet that over time, and look forward to learning more about the different kinds of needs that folks have developed. So pause there and stop there, and we have 15 minutes or so left in our hour, and hope to hear from you all, your thoughts, questions. Are there particular tools or resources that you have found to be particularly valuable that we didn't mention here? Are there things that you wish you had that we didn't mention? Did we miss something? Or are there particular questions you have about the way we connected this analysis, or what the implications might be in one context or another? So send in your questions. It's webinars@synapse-energy.com, and I think some folks may have already sent some in. look to my colleagues here and see if any questions have come in along the way that we might be able to address to kick things off. I've been corrected, it is webinar at synapse-energy.com, not webinars. So webinars with a singular at synapse-energy.com to send in your question.
We received a couple questions so far. The first question about information sharing you mentioned. What are some promising venues for creating the information sharing that you recommend?
So I think this is a place where the discussion doesn't have to be regional in nature. A lot of the kinds of information that folks are interested in or have developed is national in nature. They mentioned that Desire database, so that some sort of centralized national place to go to look for insights on policy, programs, market status. I think there are some national tools already about EV penetration, for example. Yeah, I think further development of this sort of central database or library of resources, just a reference material essentially to help folks move ahead.
Next one, heat pump related tools. What heat pump related analysis tools were your respondents using? These open access tools or database available?
So the heat pump analytical tools that folks mentioned, and Kenji, you quoted the question back to me, but you could jump in here as well. But my sense is that folks, particularly at the state government level, have and the efficiency program implementer level, have developed their own in-house different kinds of tools, right? And generally to meet their particular needs in the particular circumstances where they are. There's this question of how to share that kind of tool most effectively across the region when it's the tool may be that a consultant developed a particular spreadsheet relevant to the needs of a particular state, for example. So figuring out how to share that is maybe a little challenge. But Kenji, do you recall particular heat pump related tools that folks mentioned?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, most of the tools are internal tools. Like NYSARA, Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, they have their own tools, but they are just using internally. But however, there are a few tools that could become available pretty soon. In Massachusetts, we mentioned in one of the slides, Cape Light Compact heat pump scenario analysis tool that is supposed to be is going to be released in a few months as part of the Massachusetts 3-year energy efficiency program plan. And at the same time, Navigant did a heat pump analysis tool, developed a tool for the same set of stakeholders. So that may come out at the same time.
And I will note that there are a lot of heat pump related information sources on NEEP's website, and maybe not specific tools, but specifications and market assessments and other related information.
Right, right. So this question also asks for databases. So NEEP has a heat pump database called Climate Heat Pump Database. So everybody can rely on.
One big data set that I know that I've used is that the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center makes a database of all of the heat pump installations that they have offered rebates for, incentives for, available, and that to understand how the market is moving, just having access to that raw data of those state programs has been quite valuable to us.
I received a very interesting question here, timely question.
So this question of electrification in the context of high pressure gas emergency in the Merrimack Valley here in Massachusetts, and what electric options, how electrification might play in terms of thinking about longer term and nearer term aspects of that related to that incident. Obviously, this survey conducted well in advance of that situation, but you know, I think it may have definitely an effect on how people think about electrification and the importance of fuel choice going forward. I know I have seen some folks banding together to purchase large numbers of induction cooking hot plates to be able to get to folks in that area so that they can cook even while they have no gas service. So you know, there definitely there's some action happening in that direction. I think it's a little too soon to say whether the political or policy context will respond towards electrification out of that, but it certainly might.
It suggests maybe there are some non-energy benefits that people can take into consideration as part of strategic electrification.
And no, in California, the conversation around electrification is intimately tied to questions of around the Aliso Canyon gas leak from a couple of years ago, and that sort of has colored and affected how folks there engage with electrification. You might imagine a comparable kind of impact here in the Northeast.
Okay, another question about AMI. So in Massachusetts, there's almost no AMI data available at this point, except Vermont. It's like city-like. So what states do you think will have AMI data available soon? Which states will have soon? When will that be available? Do you have any suggestions for getting the EE program administrators to release more data on EE programs, which could be helpful for the questions raised and the interest in the data on heat pump deployments?
I think my initial sense of where to look for leadership on that is to Vermont. Vermont has had statewide AMI for 7 or 8 years at this point, and the folks at the Efficiency Vermont have been working with that data, and there's always a question of getting access to the data is a very different thing than getting access to insights from the data. The data is covered by all sorts of confidentiality and personal data concerns, but the insights resulting from processing that data. I know some folks from VEIC presented analysis of trying to back out the load shape of different kinds of efficiency measures, including heat pumps, from AMI data at the ACEEE summer study last month. So that that kind of analysis is possible, and I think will grow as access to that data grows. There is this looming challenge question around not actually having access to AMI data, as the question mentioned in many states. So we may have to look and try to extrapolate from lessons learned in other places as well. Washington D.C. has AMI data, for example. It's not quite as cold there as it is here, but what can we learn? Same in California. So how do we learn from what we have potentially to play into the question of how to justify AMI deployment in places where it isn't yet deployed.
Just from the region, I can say that Maine and one utility in Connecticut and some other municipal utilities in Massachusetts also have AMI, so there is a lot of possible transferability within this region.
Good, thank you. A few more questions, interesting ones. I guess this one especially. For folks outside of New England region, what are some lessons from this survey for other regions?
Yeah, so one thing, as we talk about electrification as as a thing that's coming in different regions around the country. One often hears and thinks of the Northeast as being on the leading edge of that conversation, but I think a lesson from this survey to folks in other regions is that while we in the Northeast may in fact be on the leading edge, it's not that we have answered all the questions and are miles ahead. There's still plenty of work to do here, and there's still folks in other regions shouldn't feel like we've got all their answers ready and waiting for them. So folks in other regions can step up and develop the tools and the data and analyses in their areas as well. I do think there are a lot of commonalities in terms of the needs, the set of needs feels like that we've identified through this survey feels like it would likely be reasonably equivalent to the kinds of needs that folks in other regions would encounter when trying to undertake the same type of policy analysis. I do think that replicating something like this survey in other places, however, might help to broaden the conversation that much further and identify whether there are particular needs, related to, how electrification relates to power supply questions. For example, the Pacific Northwest and the Upper Midwest and the Southeast and the Northeast are likely to be pretty different on those questions. So we might be able to learn something from that kind of cross comparison between regions as well. But yeah, if you're not in the Northeast, don't feel like you're getting left behind. Because still don't have to do much. You do have to do something to catch up to some of the states in the Northeast, but you don't necessarily have to do a lot. And we would think the states in the Northeast would welcome more company in thinking deeply about these issues.
I just got this comment from Stagewell. They will present some of the AMI metadata analysis they did at the upcoming NEEP summit in 2 weeks. Please attend the NEEP summit to learn about AMI.
Thank you. Yes, learning about AMI and that summit will have many opportunities for dialogue on the topic of strategic electrification.
One last question as we come up on the hour, and just a reminder, there will be a 2-question survey on your way out, and we very much hope that you will answer that. But final question, are there any special opportunities for strategic electrification in towns that have local control of their electrical system through a municipal light plant? Maybe Kenji wanted to take a shot at answering that one.
I guess Vermont Light, as Asa mentioned, is leading this sort of effort and trying to test EV. They have EV pilot program, and they're using AMI to find out the impacts of EV. Mm-hmm. That's one area.
Right. And I think that on the question of sort of local impact, distribution system impact, that there are real advantages to locality, to lack of scale, right? To being able to sort of work with, on a more granular detail level with a more countable, limited amount of infrastructure, right? That being able to have to actually not having to work in bulk, right? And actually the particular insights might be able to be gained about the sort of the practicalities of local markets. What does it actually take on a personal level to get folks to think about electrification? What barriers do they actually face? When it's a local scale, handful of customer service reps who take all of the calls from everybody, there's potential for faster iteration, for testing things that might be possible at that scale that it might not be possible at the statewide scale. So thank you all very much for a good hour and for living up to our billing of trying to get this interactive and lots of questions. We really